Hello, everybody. Welcome to American Government. My name is Devin Marconi, and this is going to be a little bit different than a traditional American Government course because we have to do this in 10 weeks. And, well, sadly, we're remote and I won't be able to see you guys face to face. So, with that, we're going to have a couple lectures that are a bit condensed. And I beg that you do one thing throughout this semester. Please reach out to me whenever you can. I want to create a bond with every one of you. I want to be able to engage with you and connect with your work as well. And there are many aspects of this course in which we're going to be able to tailor it to your interests. So I'm excited to learn more about you, what you think is important about it within our own government, and have a fun journey together as we learn about the systems that guide our lives. So in today's lecture, we're going to do two things. We're going to start by really going a quick overview of what I expect on my end in this course, how the grades are structured, some of the assignments, some of the expectations, and then I'm going to dive into what normally is the first 2 weeks of lectures in my traditional American government course. So it's going to be a little bit longer than many of the past lectures today, but bear with me. We'll have I kind of paced it to where we have 2 weeks scattered throughout the semester, I believe, but don't hold me on this, roughly week 4 and 9 or 8, somewhere in there, in which we'll be able to breathe a little bit, make sure we understand the content, and really just reevaluate where we are. So before we get into this, I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Devin Marconi, as I've already said. I've been teaching here at the community college for the last 3 years now. I have taught this course many times at this point, but I still believe there are many points in which I can grow and learn. So if there's anything that you believe would strengthen the lectures, if I included something you learned in a past course or something you believe is essential to understanding government, reach out to me. I am always looking for opportunities to expand my course. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I studied down in Missoula at the University of Montana, where I got my three big degrees of a bachelor's in political science with international relations as my concentration. I also got another bachelor's in Central Southwest Asian studies, but I summarize that as it's a history and politics of the Middle East, the contemporary Middle East. Additionally, I got a master's in political science studying the phenomenon of political polarization. So that's a topic you'll be able to, if you choose, write your term paper on. And I would love to help you out with that. And it's a very exciting topic, and I love to rant about it whenever I get the opportunity to. So that's a little bit about my educational background. I moved to Montana a few years ago from Richmond, Virginia, where I went to a community college and myself, so I understand this perspective. I understand that where we start does not determine where we end, and we could have some Harvard graduates in this class. So let's get going with this. And a little bit about my personality. I'm a diehard Knicks fan. My family's from Brooklyn, New York, but my other side of the family's from Scobie, Montana. So I got a little bit of both backgrounds in me, and you'll probably see those throughout these lectures. There are probably a million other things that I could tell you that I'm forgetting, as we all do when we have these awkward introductions. But let's get going. All right, so here normally in the learning objectives, I'll either have bullet points that tell you what you should understand at the end of the lecture, or I'll have questions that you should be able to answer at the end of the lecture. This varies based on the content in the week. I've learned that the question structure has been more productive, so I'm transitioning to that. But since this is an overview, today we're just going to do the bullet points. So a lot of this I've already said, understand the requirements of the course. I like to do a discussionary introduction to the course by talking about political science, state, and democracy, which you'll see in a second. We're also going to talk about three forms of government, systems of government: unitary, confederal, and federal. Which are we? We'll be able to answer that at the end. We're going to look at some influential actors, John Adams, Samuel Adams, and make sure we understand the distinction between their two very different impacts in early American government. Look at some key points in our history, like the Constitutional Convention, incentives for it, the repercussions of it, the look at the Bill of Rights, the divide between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which we'll pick up on in more detail next week, and then we'll dive into some of the Federalist Papers. So let's begin. So first, the course overview. With grades, this is how it's going to be structured. I can guarantee that. We have 10% of our grade coming from our discussion posts, which is one of the main ways I track participation in the course. you're going to have to contribute 4 posts for every thread. That means you will post 3 posts every odd number week. Week 1, you will have to post 3 posts today. Well, this week. And then every even number week, you give a single follow-up. So 4 total posts. A discussion thread will last 2 weeks, and then we'll start a new one. And there will be a document on Eagle Online explaining the details of this. It's not tricky, but there are many aspects of this that have confused students in the past. So please make sure you read the document and go over everything I say about the discussion posts to make sure you're reading the full requirements. We will have 3 quizzes in this course. They will consist of 25% of your grade. We will also have at least 3 assignments. We might have 1 added in there. We'll have a final essay and a final exam. So a lot of this course is going to be preparing for our final essay and final exam. A quick hint that I might not say again in this course, your final exam will consist of majority the quiz questions you've engaged with in the past and more content, as we will include the 4th quarter of the course as well. So making sure you do well on the quizzes directly impacts how well you'll do on the final exam and provides a great studying tool for the future. And that final essay is something I will work with you throughout the semester if you reach out for help. I will not know if you need help unless you communicate, but I will give help to anybody who desires it and reaches out. Now, discussion post, here's an overview. This is primarily just for you to review, pause the video and look at this. I'm going to continue moving on. I will answer any questions you have via email. And real quick, before I go into the concept of political science, I do want to say, if you have any issues, email me with as much detail as possible, asking the question. I think the best pathway to getting your questions answered is by emailing me them with detail. And if I cannot answer them in a quick, direct email, we can schedule a Zoom. And if you want to jump to the Zoom step, we can do that. But I suggest it's better to have a written response so you can revisit it in the future. And I know on these Zoom calls, sometimes in 30 minutes, an hour, it's hard to take perfect notes on what I'm rambling on about. So I suggest that you write me detailed emails when you have any questions before we schedule Zoom, but I will be available for Zoom for any of you whenever you need it, whenever fits your schedule best. So what is political science? Okay, so political science is the study of governmental systems that you know, of course, the people that run them, of course, because we talk about politicians all the time, maybe a little too much, and then the people they govern. You can't forget about the third most important part of politics, us, the citizens and the voters of the nation. Or maybe they're not able to vote, but we are. We are voters and citizens. We also see when you study political science and at the college level, you're going to traditionally have 3 subdisciplines and American government that you can dive into. These subdisciplines, the international relations is the one that I'm a little biased leaning towards. There's also political theory and comparative politics. International relations, think of it as what's happening on the international stage, how are we competing with other nations? While comparative politics is more or less how do our systems of government compare to their systems and structures of government. While political theory is why do we do what we do? What does human nature tell us about the way we let people govern our lives? It's beautiful stuff. It's fascinating. I teach a political theory course as well, and I love to yell and rant about all the theorists that inspire us and infuriate us at the same time. When you look at political science, it's important to understand that this is a discipline that hits the gray area of many others. You have to study history, philosophy, psychology, demography, linguistics, economics, and so much more when you study political science. It is an expansive topic, and you're oftentimes working at the intersection of 2 contrasting issues. So here's the lecture I want to go in on with and talk about what a state is. So while I go over this slide, I want to ask you all to please just personally, internally, identify which definition you believe is the most accurate. Which definition rings true to you and most accurately summarizes what a state is. You know, a state, not Montana, Virginia. I'm talking about the United States, Germany, France, Austria, states, nations. What is a state? So You could define a state as one, any power which has authority over men. That's pretty. I like that. Focuses on the structures of authority. Just like I said, these are the structures that guide and regulate our lives. Two, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That's a bit tedious of a definition, but it's kind of like gives us requirements. You have to be human. That's cool. Ants can't create states. I mean, they could create mounds, but I don't think you could get a state in there. Human community successfully claims you can't fail. You got to be successful. Victor tells history. History is told from the eyes of victors. Yeah, I botched that quote. We'll move on from that. Successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. Monopoly, that's a really good board game. I should play that again. And legitimate use of physical force. So Monopoly, they have absolute control. They are the only one with legitimate use of physical force. Think of what the police do. Is there a police collective, or is it like the Wild West where we can all just deal with our own conflicts? And within a given territory, this can't be distributed throughout the entire globe in various communities. You have to have a specific location. You have to be able to say this is our state. That's a fascinating. You get a lot of requirements in that definition. I mean, it could ring true, but it could also be a little bit too tedious. Sometimes life is simple. Sometimes it's just a system in which there is authority. You see that third definition, a union of families and villages having for its end a perfect and self-sufficing life, by which we mean a happy and honorable life. End quote. That is pretty. I didn't know that states were always structured to provide happiness, but that I like that angle. I'd hope my state is structured to provide happiness. And I also like the thought of families and villages really starting from the local level, building upwards to create the state in response to the needs of the families and villages. I like that one. I mean, all of these so far have tracked in some positive direction. The end one, quote, a body of free persons united together for the common benefit to enjoy peaceably what is their own and to do justice to others, end quote. That's another pretty one. I like it. Free persons. You want to emphasize that a state. Well, actually, that's an interesting one. Are all states in which everyone is a free person? I like that this definition requires that. It does also have a grassroots type of feel, a bottom-up understanding. Well, whatever definition you believe rings true, I really want you to emphasize it right now. Read it to yourself one more time and say that's the one, because you might have the right answer. Well, this lecture is not intended to have you pick the correct multiple choice answer out of these four, but instead aim to help you understand one of the key points I like to emphasize when we talk about politics and government at large. Every one of these definitions comes from some of the most respected authors and sources of information that exist in this country and internationally. Every definition is absolutely accepted in nearly all conditions of discussing politics. But when we look at these definitions, first I want to go through where they come from. The first definition, any power which has authority over men, Machiavelli wrote that, one of the greatest political theorists in human history, the Renaissance era of writing. Second definition, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Well, this comes from a world-renowned political scientist, Max Weber, writing at a period of significant international conflict in 1946, right at the end of the World War II. I guess new coming peace and not as much conflict as the war had just ended. He's also writing from Germany. Fascinating aspect. Second, a widely respected definition of a state. The third, a union of families and villages. This definition stems from one of the first political theorists of all time, Aristotle, one of the greatest Western philosophers of all time. And then that fourth definition. That definition stems from the Supreme Court of the United States. As we see, every one of these definitions has their place and value and is utilized to this very day. But when you look at the definitions and you say something like, we need to strengthen the state, Depending on what definition you utilize to make that statement, you're emphasizing different steps to be done to achieve that goal of strengthening the state. Say you rely on the first definition and you want to strengthen the state. Well, the best move would be to strengthen the police forces, strengthen the ability to control and have authority over citizens. The second definition, you would strengthen the police forces. You would make sure you have a more firm monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, but you would also have a heavy focus on maintaining a specific geographical territory, maintaining a happy human population. That third definition, if you wanted to strengthen the state and you utilize the third definition, you would probably not provide much additional funding to police and military matters. Instead, you would provide more funding to the well-being and the lives of families. If you rely on that fourth definition, you wouldn't focus on any of those things, but instead maintain the strongest Bill of Rights protecting the individual liberties of your citizens. When we talk about politics, terms as simple as a state, as democracy, as Democrat, Republican, whatever terms you use constantly, when you talk to another person who may have a different conclusion on this topic, they most likely, very likely, are relying on a different definition, maybe many different definitions. And one thing that I hope we can do through our discussions and throughout this course is strengthen our abilities to provide the definitions we provide the definitions we rely on when discussing politics, and have the aim to identify the definitions relied upon by others. So, no need to remember any of these definitions, but just remember the takeaway. When we talk about terms, you can accurately define them, of course. I'm going to ask for a lot of accurate definitions in this course. It's going to be a lot of quiz questions. A lot of the questions on the final exam will say, define pluralism, define this term, and there is a right and a wrong answer, but there are many right answers, and the different approaches you take lead to different conclusions, and try your best to understand other people's approaches and present your approach to others. When I do this in person, I do the same thing with this point. I provide these definitions of a democracy. Just for time's sake, since we have so much to cover today, I just want to give you the origins of these definitions. The first definition comes from Aristotle. The second definition comes from our great Honest Abe Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And the third definition comes from another world-renowned, well-respected political scientist, Joseph Schumpeter. So now that we've talked about the nuanced definitions that exist in politics and the goal that I hope we can all maintain in this course of providing our definitions and aiming to obtain the definitions relied on by others, let's talk about some concrete terms. What is the United States? What system of government do we have? We're going to understand this through two general approaches. The first is understanding what form of democracy we have, because we always say we are the leader of the free world. Well, maybe, that faded out as much. You heard it in 8 Mile, Eminem back in the day. It's still a thing. We are the leader of the free world. That would be the president in that statement. I'll make some random references throughout this course, by the way. But it's important to understand democracy. And what type of democracy do we have? Well, the most concrete and direct form of democracy is direct democracy. And we do not have this form in the United States. We have variations of this, but we do not have direct democracy. Direct democracy is when the people govern the state directly by the state holding a vote before performing any action. This requires frequent engagement with the general population, constant voting, and we've seen in states like the Roman Republic in the past, one of the earliest forms of a direct democracy, we see constant debate and engagement with the general population or those who have been given the right to have a say in politics of the population. In the United States, we do not, although we have referendums and we have the ability to vote on various bills and not bills, but referendums that are put on the ballot during election cycles, we do not engage with our government every time they take action. So we are not a direct democracy. And instead, what we do, instead of constant and direct engagement, we elect representatives to represent our interest within this government. Of course, This is a representative democracy in which citizens have the right to elect representatives to govern the state, which is what we live in modern America. Now, as every engaged little political scientist out there who hears this lecture for the first time, I see some of you fuming in your seats when I teach this in person. We're a republic. We're a republic. That the founding fathers constantly called us a republic. That is true. But I also want to point out through the text of our founding fathers, especially James Madison, the author of many of the Federalist Papers, second to only Alexander Hamilton, we see in Federalist Paper number 10, one of the most important of all of the texts that we will be reading next week, actually. And number 14, he uses these terms. He mentions a democracy. And when we extract what he's saying in that text, we see that he generally defines a democracy as a small extent of territory with constant assembly to make laws and address important matters. What that means is a small population in which you have constant gathering and debate in which you determine how to address important matters and draft legislation. Now, a republic varies, and according to James Madison's own definition, a republic is a regime. A regime is a system of government in which a scheme of representation takes place. A scheme of representation takes place. In other words, a representative democracy. So we will be using in this course republic and representative democracy interchangeably. If you dive into a upper division political science course, these terms will maintain and obtain a little bit more nuance, and you'll be able to decipher the differences a little bit better. But according to the text of James Madison, modern English, I guess you could say, would most accurately define the state that he called a republic as a representative democracy. Now, what form of government do we have? Remember, I said we're going to take an aim at understanding our system of government through two angles: this form of democracy that exists and the structure in which our government, our power is distributed within government. That's a good way to put it. The structure in which power is distributed in government. Well, there are three general approaches: unitary, confederal, and federal. We'll visualize them and then provide written definitions in the next slide. The visualizations you can see here. Unitary is what is seen to the left with the blue background, in which you have a central government with power and legislation being distributed downwards. So think of this as Washington, D.C. writes all of the legislation. Washington, D.C. has absolute control over what happens in every single state. They have the power to tell Montana to enact this tax code. Then Montana will have to enact that tax code, and that is how power is distributed. Authority is concentrated in the hands of the central government. In America's example, Washington, D.C. Now we have additionally a confederal system of government in which power is concentrated in the states and distributed. So we would see that Virginia and Montana, these two states, would have equal amount of power, and they would actually have influence over what Washington, D.C., the central government, would do in any matters. You would probably see a confederal system having frequent assembly among the states in which they determine how to influence the central government. And then finally, and that is the one in the middle, and then we have federal, the one to the right, in which you see the arrows going in both directions. You have an equal exchange of power distributed. You have independent states with authority over certain actions, while you do have a central government that does have authority to determine and maintain unity, determine laws and maintain unity among all of the states. We in the United States maintain a federal system of government. We have heard that term many a times: federalism, the federal government, the federal many things, federal jobs. Federal system of government exists in the United States today and is depicted by the image to the right with the green background. Now, in our past, it is important to understand that there are many unitary governments. The U.S. has never maintained a unitary system of government, but the U.S. has maintained a confederal system of government during the Articles of Confederation, which we will explore in just a moment. But it was a very short-lived system of government, and we have since then not seen a confederal system in a sovereign state, but we do see a generally confederal system existing in the structure of the European Union, which is a primarily economic assembly, but we can see that it is a structure that is mirrored and implemented in that system but does not exist in a single sovereign nation in the globe. Sovereign nation, I mean the United States, France, a single nation, not a European Union is a collection of nations, of separate sovereign nations who agreed to have an economic alignment, trying to provide simple definitions as we go. Now, here are some written definitions of these terms. For sake of time, I will recommend that you pause this and look at these definitions. Okay, so now we're going to start our dive into early American history. Now that we understand some structural definitions and the approach of this course, let's talk about our early days. So, as we all know, I want to do the vaguest and quickest overview, which is just, coattailing off of what you learned in high school history. Why did we have the revolution? Well, we know that we know the simple incentives for the American Revolution. We had the Boston Massacre. There was a tax on tea. No taxation without representation. The Stamp Act really sparked the dissent against that, and a lack of representation within the system of government that dictated our lives at the time, which was Great Britain. We also see there were incentives for Britain to maintain dominance over the colonies at the time. And these two incentives primarily, when oversimplified, of course, we don't have the time to dive into this in depth, but we understand that it is the monopoly of trade of those raw materials that benefited Britain exponentially and really incentivized a great deal of expansion and colonialism in that time period globally. So they were able to come to the United States. This, of course, was not the United States yet, to the Americas, and trade these raw materials at whatever price they determined that was not available to the rest of the world from their ports. So we see these incentives on both sides boiled over to create what we know as the American Revolution. There is so much I'm skipping over, but we remember this from high school history, and I will not be quizzing you on it. Now, when we implemented our first system of government, we implemented what we call the Articles of Confederation. This system of government had some general goals, and understanding the goals helps you understand why we structured our government in this form. So first off, this is a system, this is a confederal system, and remember that definition is where power is concentrated among the many states or smaller entities and then distributed upwards, and they determine the actions of the federal government, of the central government, and we see that as Montana and Virginia coming together to tell Washington, D.C. what to do. So when we look at the goals of this new system of government, this was implemented through a document, the Articles of Confederation. We see that they had the general goals of avoiding becoming a monarchy. We must not become what we just rebelled against. We cannot become another Great Britain just across the big sea. And we also must avoid the secession of states. In order to fight this revolution, we had to build up militaries and armies on the state level. We also, due to that, incurred mass debt on state levels that varied exponentially. So many states were dealing with very different threats, very different issues, and very different economic standing. So we need to find a way to unite these states and make sure that we do not have the secession of any of them. Because if we lose any of these states at that time in our history, our chances of survival were significantly cut. And we also need to avoid being subservient to foreign powers. Remember what I just said? Each state had significant amounts of debt. Now we can't just continue building debt. We can't just become subservient to France, the Dutch, or any other nation that's the Spanish, willing to provide funds to the United States. So we had to make sure that we maintain low amounts of debt early on between the states. We also need to protect natural rights. This is a time period in which many of our founding fathers were reading the text of authors like John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, many others writing about the concepts of what it means to be a human being and to have your rights protected by nature, I guess you could say. What rights do all states have the requirement of providing their citizens? Well, we need to protect natural rights. We also need to protect laws from men. This is a concept that every time I teach this in person, somebody in the class goes, "What does that even mean?" And that makes sense. It's a It's a weird quote. But think of it this way. I use some quotes to help summarize this sentiment. We are a nation of laws, not of men. John Adams. End quote. In question of power, then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. The Constitution was not a document sparking our necessary freedoms, but our government's restrictions, maintaining the freedoms of individuals. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about individual liberties and civil rights. But right now, we just want to understand that our founding fathers wanted to make sure that a government was not too responsive to a single generation. As generations change and the threats to each generation changes with it. So we need to make sure that the interests, sometimes the fears of a single generation do not spark the legislation that impacts future generations as well. We protect laws from men. Just like we need to protect natural rights founded off of the text of human nature, we need to protect the laws from our own human nature, as John Locke, Bentham, all those great philosophers, political theorists also identified the benefits and detriments of human nature. And our founding fathers really adapted this concept, strengthen our benefits and restrict our detriments. Now, while we had this Articles of Confederation, as I mentioned before, this was a system in which we had power originating from the states, determining the actions of the central government. We had very little tying the states together. Our central government consisted of primarily, well, representatives. We did not have a military. We did not have a federal bank. We did not have much going on at the national, the central government on the national level. But we did see many states strengthening their entities. We saw militias existing only on the states. We saw many governmental actions taking place first within the states and then the central government. But during this period, we saw that when we had issues occurring in multiple states, or issues occurring that were so jarring that the state militias were not able to quickly respond, the central government was not there to help. We did not have what we think of today as that strong U.S. military to come in and save the day, I guess one could say. So what happens when conflict does hit a certain point and you don't have a central government to respond? Well, there's a period in U.S. history after we implemented this system of government, the Articles of Confederation, which was a confederal system, where the flaws of this system were revealed at large. And this day, this moment, is Shays' Rebellion. Well, as I mentioned before, there was a lot of debt being incurred on the state levels. And some of these state governments were telling the farmers to start paying up through taxes, and taxes that were way too high for what they were able to provide at the time. This sparked mass rebellions throughout some states, and in Massachusetts you saw the most significant of all of these rebellions. So the state government asked to collect taxes, and fascinating, in hard currency, not paper money, which was in even shorter supply at the time. There was a significant amount of foreclosures occurring at the time. And in addition to the states requiring this of their farmers and citizens, we saw that the federal government, the central government, had basically they had no response. There was no legislation agreed upon to address this issue of taxation immediately after the Revolutionary War. Now, what happened is you have an individual by the name of Daniel Shay, an ex-Continental Army captain, who led a revolt. And this revolt included shutting down many courts that were trying to implement foreclosures and preventing those foreclosures. And at the peak of this conflict, we see an attempt to raid and seize the federal arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, just the state arsenal in Massachusetts in 1787. And this rebellion, of course, as we know, we did not have a national military. This rebellion was only tamed by local privately funded militia groups, not federal troops. So At the end of this conflict, we have had significant losses, significant turmoil within the United States, states struggling to enact tax policies, which is one of the requirements to a state if you look at a fifth definition provided by a great political scientist. We see that there were many weaknesses exposed. Our central government under this system does not respond with legislation, it does not respond to protect its citizens, and it does not provide adequately what the citizens and the states require of it. So what happens? This revealed the need to hold a constitutional convention. And we need to restructure the system of government we have in the United States. Now, in review, the Articles of Confederation established a weak central government. In this system, power and authority was designated to the states, and you have also entities that we rely on the federal level not existing. No militaries, no federal bank, exclusively reliant on states. States with variations of conflict. We also see confederation, a definition provided in our textbook, one that is not required in this course, but if you're interested in political science, it's a great textbook and I suggest you get it because it really helps add a little bit more to every discussion we have, but I do want to emphasize that it's not required. For those of you who stuck through the whole lecture, you learned that nice little bit of information. Also, you could have just read the syllabus. So confederation, a voluntary association of independent states. That's the key point right there. All the states are independent. That unity that is required to tame revolts, to address conflicts that impact multiple states, does not exist in a confederation. Unless it has been a well-established confederation, like, you could look at the European Union, they are able to solve some issues unitarily. So we see that Shays' Rebellion occurred, revealed the weaknesses of the federal government under the Articles. This was, of course, as we know, an armed rebellion in Massachusetts, and it incentivized the Constitutional Convention of 1787, as we knew that we cannot have a system in which we can't protect our citizens to that extent. So we experienced a transition. The Articles of Confederation failed us, and we must have a Constitutional Convention and replace it with a new system. Now, what is this system? Well, this system is the United States Constitution. So thank you, Shays' Rebellion, for providing us the U.S. Constitution, although it was an avenue that I would not have wanted to go about. So Shays' Rebellion revealed the weaknesses of the federal government, could not respond through legislation or military protection, those two primary failures. And then we also have to understand that when we did meet and have this Constitutional Convention, it took many years. We saw the U.S. Constitution ratified in 1788, but the Bill of Rights, which we always think came with the Constitution, was not ratified for another 3 years, as it was ratified in 1791. Now, this period consisted of significant debate. It took a year for the U.S. Constitution to be ratified, let alone the Bill of Rights. There was not unanimous support for the Constitution, and we actually see the Federalist Papers are texts that were written with the purpose of influencing individuals to ratify this Constitution and approve of this new form of government. So this period of debate occurred. Writings in support and against the new Constitution. We see these writings as the Federalist Papers in support of ratifying the Constitution and the Anti-Federalist Papers not supporting the ratification and encouraging either the Articles, reimplementation and restructuring, or a reevaluation through another Constitutional Convention. You see a bit of a nuance among the Anti-Federalists, where the Federalists are a bit more unanimous in their agreement, in their positions. We'll talk about that in just a few slides. We see the Bill of Rights. Some could argue that it was adopted as a compromise to maintain protections for states at the time, later adapted through selective incorporation to protect individuals. Don't worry about that, but do remember that the Bill of Rights was first adopted as a compromise to ensure the ratification of the Constitution and to provide states individual liberty protections from the strengthening central government. Now, also, this is a time period where we had some significant actors taking a role in our government, especially when we look at two individuals in the same family. And I really mainly cover these two because I was a teaching assistant at the University of Montana, and one of the professors I worked for covered this in their early lectures. And when I would grade those exams and quizzes, almost like a surprising amount of people flipped John Adams and Samuel Adams, although they had significantly different impacts. So let's remember, revolutionary Samuel Adams. This nickname doesn't flow as well, but the next one, it makes more sense. So the revolutionary Samuel Adams, also known as the father of the Revolution, we know him and remember him from early American history as the individual who mobilized Americans to throw tea into the Boston Harbor, dressing as Native individuals in response to the Tea Act of 1773, a significant protest which contributed to mass financial losses for Great Britain's tea companies. This you see Samuel Adams after the Boston Tea Party Act, and we see him aligning with the Anti-Federalists, and he is a second cousin to John Adams. Primary point here is remembering that Samuel Adams has a more revolutionary mindset. He is more of a mobilizer during the Revolution and takes a moderate step back in the later stages of American history, while John Adams took a very minimal role in the Revolution, almost non-existent, and then later takes on a much larger role as we create our new system of government. Now here's Judicial John Adams. See, this nickname flows a little better and it makes a little sense. So Judicial John Adams, we say this because, well, we would not have a lot of the protections of court procedures within our Bill of Rights if it were not for this individual and his actions and what he stood for in a pivotal point in American history. And that pivotal point, especially, being the Boston Massacre. Remember, we had the collective of British soldiers who shot openly into the crowd, killing many, and this pivotal point in U.S. history in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, at the time, conflicts like this were dealt with haste and often anger, frustration, and violence. You would see individuals at this point in American history even being tar and feathered, being abused in streets, public shaming, and various approaches that were just downright jarring to think about and see throughout history. We all know the classics of hangings and beheadings. Well, this is that time period in human history at large. And Judicial John Adams came in and said, we must have fair court procedures and due process for all. These British soldiers deserve a representative, and he represented them in court, actually getting two acquitted. We see that Judicial John Adams, became the second president of the United States, was the vice president under George Washington, and in contrast to his second cousin, he aligned with the views of the Federalists and also led the implementation of fair court procedures in the Bill of Rights. When we talk about the Bill of Rights, you'll see what I mean by his impact. So the Constitutional Convention, as I mentioned prior, remember the Shays Rebellion revealed how we have a failing system of government in the Articles of Confederation, and we must discuss how to restructure this system to respond to threats like Shays Rebellion and provide a long-lasting system. Well, during this Constitutional Convention, we had the debate that did eventually result in us having the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but it took many years. And without a couple compromises within this debate, we would not have what we have today. And two primary impacts are bicameralism and the way in which we determined representation at the time. I always say these are not acceptable on any quizzes, but I like to say it, the great and not so great compromise. It's the last time I say it. The great compromise, of course, is the great compromise. The not so great is the 3/5 compromise, and you should never use the great and not so great compromise ever again. I just like to say it because it helps with the memory. So, and this also sparked the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists regarding the ratification of the Constitutional Convention at this time. But let's talk about the Great Compromise and 3/5 compromise first. Well, the Great Compromise established bicameralism. Without this compromise, we would not have two systems, two bodies within our legislative branch. Remember, when we talk about legislative branch, we're going to go into this in a few weeks, but we remember that we have Congress, And Congress is made up of House of Representatives and the Senate. And these two bodies have different responsibilities. You have 435 members of the House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate is 100 members based on equal distribution among states. Well, at the time, our founding fathers were in heated debates about should we have representation based on the population or should we have equal representation within the legislature? And these debates were very close to ending up with only one winning out. But in the end, we found a compromise between what was the proposed Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, which I'll talk about in more detail in a moment. And to cover the Three-Fifths Compromise, in quick overview, we remember from high school history, but the Three-Fifths Compromise allowed for the Great Compromise to go into effect because it determined, well, when we use population as a metric to determine the influence that states have over others, how do we determine the population when we have so many enslaved human beings in the southern states? Well, this not so great and sometimes a bit shameful agreement determined that all enslaved individuals count as 3/5 of a human when determining the population. Of course, this is no longer in effect as we no longer have slavery and many other aspects of this which are problematic. But without this agreement, we would probably not see a House of Representatives with representation distributed, apportionment distributed based on population. Now, the two approaches to the legislature. Remember, this is the body that is tasked with writing bills and laws that dictate and drive our lives. Now, we had two different plans. You do not have to remember the details in each of these plans, but understand the compromise generally between them and how we have aspects of both within our final conclusion. And my main takeaway for you, hopefully, is compromise is beneficial. So we have, even if you're some of the greatest founding fathers and leaders and politicians in human history, compromise is beneficial. The Virginia Plan. This was written by James Madison. We all know the name, one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, in which he encouraged a two-body legislative branch. This is an aspect that won out. He wanted representation in both bodies, though, to be based on the population. This is a failed point of his plan. And he additionally proposed 3 branches of government with checks and balances within this plan. Another aspect which was later adapted in our new system of government as we have divided power between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Now we also see a New Jersey plan. And it's important to remember, Virginia was at the time the largest state in the entire Union, and the New Jersey was and as it still is, a quite small state among them all, especially considering population. Well, William Paterson, if you ever lived out east, you know the college is named after him. He wrote the New Jersey Plan. In this body, he encouraged Congress to be made up of a single body, so no House and Senate, just one Congress. And in this Congress, he wanted individual representation based exclusively off of equal distribution. And he wanted to say, hey, it doesn't matter how big Virginia is. New Jersey and Virginia have equal influence on the government. Well, aspects of that plan won out. Additionally, throughout this plan, of course, these are written and proposed plans that you can find online. You see, additionally proposed a Supreme Court and a federal agency to tax trade. So we see that those proposals did win out and were finally implemented within the final U.S. Constitution. So, overview, we do see a two-body legislative branch, one of which is based on population, while the other is based on equal distribution. We see 3 branches of government with checks and balances through the executive, legislative, and judicial, but we also see a Supreme Court acting as the highest court in the judicial branch and federal agencies to tax trade. Now, here's the overview. Remember, do not call them the not so great and great compromises. Remember them for what they are truly. And just a little overview, these occurred at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Great Compromise established bicameralism. Bicameralism is dividing power within a legislature into 2 distinct bodies, the House and the Senate. That's the bodies that exist in the United States. While the Three-Fifths Compromise, representatives in the House will be determined by population, and our Constitution says, quote, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Some text in our early Constitution and early documents are a bit jarring, but without these compromises, we would not have the system we have today. And these are compromises in which we've improved upon and fixed these faults. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, maintained the 10 amendments, and with the 10th primarily being used to convey here the role and responsibility of state and federal governments, solidifying a federal system of government. Now, another bit more overview of bicameralism. Here's a concrete definition of bicameralism and some bullet points for the Great Compromise. This resulted in the House and the Senate. Please make sure you pause this and go over this slide independently until you are confident. Now, the U.S. Constitution. States had their own constitutions prior to the drafting of the national constitution, something that a lot of people are not aware of. Other nations, many of which also have constitutions, many of which came before the United States Constitution. Now, we also see that Delaware was the first of the states when ratifying the federal constitution to agree in 1787, and then 3 years later is when we have the last state ratifying, which was Rhode Island. So the ratification process of accepting, agreeing, and debating our Constitution took 3 years and occurred on a state-by-state basis. This U.S. Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, and it included, later to be included, a Bill of Rights that was ratified in 1791 through a similar process. So, the Great Compromise, as we just said again, this is a very important aspect of our Constitutional Convention and our U.S. Constitution, as it resulted in the House of Representatives maintaining apportionment based on the population, and the Senate apportionment based on equal distribution among states. We have a Supreme Court and 3 branches of government with checks and balances over each other. A lot of this is coming fast and quick, but a lot of this is also overview from what we understand through living as citizens and high school history. Now, one thing that we all oftentimes do not know and do not remember from high school history is that another point in which we had to compromise in early American history is when James Madison first proposed the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights consisted of 17 amendments in its first proposal. We, of course, know today the Bill of Rights has 10 amendments, which we will have to remember. But it is important to understand, in order to obtain those 10 amendments, we had to reject 7 or amend them to include them in other amendments that we have today. Now, this is a very extreme oversimplification. You can dive into the text of James Madison's original 17 amendments and explore the nuances of each of these proposed amendments, but I tried to give a one-sentence summary for each of them. So we had what was originally the First Amendment was an amendment to regulate the number of citizens per representative. This was not maintained, as James Madison's original proposal was somewhere around 30,000 citizens to every representative. We have many districts in which we have over 100,000 citizens to each representative, and this actually varies significantly. We have some states like Wyoming in which representation is about 45,000 citizens to every one representative, but we do see there was a general aim to keep it at 30,000. Fascinating aspect of James Madison's proposal, which some wish we were able to maintain, but if we maintain that, our House of Representatives would have, I don't know the exact number, but hundreds more representatives than we do today. We did add more representatives over time. Sorry, my cat is every now and then going to be going crazy behind me. Up until the early 1900s, in which we stopped adding representatives to the House of Representatives and capped it at 435. We also see Congress shall not increase pay to representatives until after an election. Fascinating detail we'll cover at the end of this course. That which was originally the Second Amendment is now the 27th Amendment. And we'll talk about the origins, the revival of that amendment later on, which is very fascinating. Third Amendment originally proposed Third Amendment, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. This was amended to be included in the First Amendment, as you would know. Freedom of speech, assembly, and religion. 11th, no one can appeal the ruling of the Supreme Court. Protects checks and balances and emphasizes the role of the three branches. And we also see additional amendments primarily revolving around the judicial process that were merged with others. So we see these, you do not have to remember any of these amendments, any of the structures, other than there were originally 17 amendments in James Madison's first proposal, narrowed down to 10, and then ratified in 1791. Now the Bill of Rights. You have to at least give me a one-sentence summary of each of these amendments. The first, freedom of speech, assembly, and religion. The second, right to bear arms and a well-regulated militia. Third, you must not be forced to house and quarter soldiers. This is not really in effect that much anymore. You don't really have soldiers showing up at your door like, we need a meal and a bed. But that did happen at various points in U.S. history, and that is why we have the Third Amendment. We have the unreasonable search and seizure. This is something you see in contemporary days when you think about police traffic stops and your vehicles. They have to have reason to search and things of that nature. We also see the Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy, and it additionally protects one from being a witness against themselves. Various old TV shows and contemporary shows and movies reference this. I plead the fifth. I plead the fifth. And that generally means I will not speak against myself in a court setting. Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a speedy and public trial. We cannot arrest you and say, all right, we're going to put you in front of a court in 3 years. No, it has to be relatively quick as possible, and a public trial in which the general population has to be able to access the trial. You cannot be closed off, basically stating, say you were arrested, your parents have a right to know how the trial is going and why you may be put to jail or whatever it may be, so it has to be public. Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury of peers. You must have a jury of peers, equal citizens, determining the ruling in some court procedures. This is to avoid an elitism in this system. And Eighth Amendment, no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. You see some interesting later on, we'll talk about interpretation of the Constitution, originalists or living constitutionalists. This is where you have a fun debate about that. Is it cruel and unusual? So you could be cruel or unusual, but you can't be both. We'll talk about that later on, but current interpretations, you cannot have cruel or unusual punishment or excessive bail. You can't be arrested for a drug charge and then be asked to pay $10 million to have your bail set. And then Ninth Amendment, no amendment shall override rights granted by the Constitution. A bit nuanced, but you can't have legislation overruling amendments in our Constitution. And the 10th Amendment, all power that is not delegated to the federal government shall be left to the states and the people. Got to remember that second part, and the people. If the federal government has not determined actions or a path of action for a certain policy, the states have the right to determine the actions. Sorry, my cat. Hey, Mo. That's Mo. She's an evil little calico cat that likes to destroy all things possible. You will see her often. Federalists and anti-federalists. Now, we had a divide that sparked at this time period. And it is important to understand that, remember, that this is not the first political party system in the United States. We'll cover the first political party system in the United States next week. This is the first time we had a divide among debate. And the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, remember, they are representative of their works and the positions they advocated for in their text, the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. These were published in newspapers and journals throughout the northeastern region of the United States and in Virginia, which is kind of like the line. But we see that in this divide, it was primarily revolving around the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and the nuances that came with that. Federalists wanted the Constitution to be ratified. The Anti-Federalists did not want the ratification of the Constitution. So when we read, which you will be asked to read some of them this week, we have to understand what we're trying to identify in these texts and their incentives for writing them. Trying to convey the population over that 3-year period, 78 to 87 to 90, I almost messed up, to ratify that Constitution or encourage their representatives to ratify the Constitution. Now, some background of these two collectives, and it is important to understand this as this develops later on. And so, who are the Federalists and who are the Anti-Federalists? So we know the overarching conflict is the ratification of the federal government, of the Constitution, which was aimed at implementing a strong central government. So the Federalists wanted the ratification of the Constitution and a strong central government. The Federalists tended to come from the North, Northeast industrial states. They were urban. They had tighter populations. They supported the drafting of the Constitution. It's repetitive of the first. They wanted a strong national military. Remember, Shays' Rebellion did not have a national military. It was a regional militia that stopped that conflict. So we need to have a national military to respond to the Shays' Rebellions, to respond to British influence, to respond to foreign threats. We need to strengthen a military. And some of the important actors of this time period included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. The individuals writing the Federalist Papers include John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. We will go into the detail on that later on. The Anti-Federalists, these are all contrasting bullet point and summarizing points. They wanted a weak central government with strong states. They were primarily rural. They came from the South. Think of Thomas Jefferson in Virginia. You have very rural areas with a lot of dense woods separating these very different regional populations. If you really think about the Southeast, even linguistics, which is an aspect of political science, you would see that there were far more regional dialects that were extremely different in the South. Think of the Louisiana accents today, some of the classic Southern drawl, all that. You see a lot of separation between populations. So they wanted a lot of independence among those populations. A little rambling on to just paint the picture for you. Now they were rural. They did not want the Constitution to be ratified because they didn't want a strong central government. And they did not want a national military. No national military. They did not want that entity because they thought we could address these threats on the state level by building up state militias and through that Second Amendment being enforced, which would be, of course, we don't have the Second Amendment yet, but through the concept of the right to bear arms through localized militias. And they advocated for the Bill of Rights, which was the protection of, which was a position they identified after the Constitution was ratified, to maintain a protection of civil liberties for the states. We'll go into that later on in this course. Some noteworthy individuals, you have Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, George Mason, many of those individuals, a lot of which also have colleges named after them in the East. Now the Federalist Papers. Who wrote the Federalist Papers? This is very important to remember. John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, with Alexander Hamilton writing the most, James Madison second, John Jay the third. When they wrote these texts, they did not sign their names. Instead, they signed the name Publius. All three of them wrote under the same pseudonym, Publius. Now, in these texts, they defended the coexistence of federalism and republicanism. We can have a republic. Republicanism is not what you think of it today. It is instead saying that we must implement a republic, also known today as a representative democracy. I see why we covered that earlier on. So in these texts, we see the defense of federalism and republicanism written by those three individuals who you will have to remember. In these texts, they have certain quotes that summarize their positions, like nothing is more certain than the need for government, end quote. End quote. The people must give to the government some of their natural rights in order to provide it with power. And to build off of that, their concept was that you would give some natural rights to strengthen the state so it can then protect you and provide the protection of other natural rights. So these concepts advocated consistently throughout these texts, in which they were very structured and maintained a persuasive form of writing. Federalist Paper number 1. We had many papers in which we will dive into, but it is important to have a general summary of what some of these generally argue for. This is written by Alexander Hamilton, and it is directly arguing for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Some of the sub-arguments made or argues that past systems of government were far too weak, that the new system would address the most significant challenges he addresses the most significant challenges to the new Constitution identified by the Anti-Federalists, and also has the defining sentiment addressing the concerns of those who were, quote, on the wrong side of the question being the question to ratify the Constitution, the question to create what we now know as the United States of America. In this text, we see, quote, yes, my countrymen, I owe to you that after having given it an attentive consideration, I am clearly of opinion it is your interest to adopt it, saying it is in not just my interest, but your interest to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Another bit from this, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. And among the most formidable of the obstacles when the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes that may hazard a diminution of power. Basically stating, the biggest challenge to this is the strong individuals who fear that the strengthening of the state results in the weakening of their power. The concepts of our system of government were founded off the idea of strengthening the people's power. Federalist Paper 51. This was written by James Madison, and in this paper, he addresses the need, and begs for the need of a system with checks and balances. In this text, he addresses security in this new form of government and addresses the reality of oppressed minorities in other systems. In this text, he says, quote, currently my box is cutting it off, so I might botch a little bit of the end of this, but, quote, the compound republic of America. The power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and the portion allocated to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other. There's a word there. Time that each will be controlled by itself. So we will have systems of government in charge of themselves, in charge of their specific responsibility, but with the power to maintain a check on other entities within the government. A concept that, if you really want to know a neat little history, a great philosopher by the name of Montesquieu was writing, trying to translate a text. In this text, they were writing about the division of church and state, and he mistranslated that text, and instead of thinking of it as separation of church and state, thought of it as separation of branches of government, and wrote a text in a different language translating that concept, and that text was later read by James Madison and adapted to become the system of checks and balances in the United States. Of course, there's a lot more to that, but there's a oversimplified step-by-step process of how unique little moments, sometimes mess-ups in history, can result in great changes that benefit many. Now, the Anti-Federalists, who are these people? Well, they called themselves Brutus, but let's be honest, they were far less organized, and they did not always use the same pseudonym. They did not have the great names that you see in the Federalist Papers, although they were great Americans and great theorists of the time. There was not unity, and we did not have as much direct accreditation given to them. Now, these individuals writing under the pseudonym of Brutus for the Federalist Papers were far less organized and feared a unitary government. They did not want a system of government in which we strengthen the central government so much so that it becomes another Britain. Of course, that is not what the Federalists were advocated for, but The Anti-Federalists thought they are moving so far in that direction that would enable that possible threat in the future. In these texts, we see them say, quote, "The limitation of government is the surest record of the happiness of the people," end quote. "And after so recent a triumph over the British king, after blood has been spent, it is truly astonishing that a set of men among our America champion a government that would destroy our liberties." Basically saying, we just fought a revolution for this concept. You're ready to give it up? And finally, the main point we need to understand, pluralism. What is pluralism? Well, it's the concept founding our system of government, a theory that views politics as a conflict among groups in which multiple groups are vying for power in a single system of government. That's the sentence. Multiple groups vying for power in a single system of government. Political decision making is characterized by compromise and accommodation, just like the stories I've been telling you today. Pluralism maintains majority rule with minority protections, and we will revisit this concept in the future, but maintain an adequate understanding of that definition, please. Now, here's the bullet points I do every single lecture. I ask you a bunch of questions at the end of the lecture, and I expect that you can answer them. But I'm not going to just expect that you go back and study and everything. I'm also going to provide the answers, which are right here. And I will restructure this. It's currently a bit botched, but I'll make sure you can read every bit of text. You might have to zoom in, pause it, and really squint your eyes every now and then because we have a lot to learn when we have a condensed course. So here are your answers to the past questions, and these are the expectations I have of you after today's lecture. And what is due this week? This is where I will tell you about the assignments you have to submit by the end of the week. Every week is structured from, it starts Monday, I'd say Monday at noon, and then it ends Sunday at 11:59 p.m. All assignments are due by then, although discussion posts have various requirements throughout the week, and the document regarding discussion posts will walk you through that. So please make sure you are meeting the requirements of the weeks. It is great to meet you guys. I'm excited to talk to you and hear about what you think is important in government. I'm glad to introduce myself, and thank you for bearing with me for an extra long lecture today. We will have many lectures in the future that are a lot shorter, and this might be one of the longest lectures since I've had to condense it due to our 10-week nature. Thank you guys for listening. It's great to meet you. Email me, just introducing yourself. Also, I have an introduction discussion post thread up there. Contribute to that. And let's have a good semester. Communication is the best step to enjoying this course. If you don't communicate, it might not be as enjoyable. So communicate. Let's find a topic for your essay when we write that we'll write about at the end of the semester that interests you, and let's make it empirical, and let's practice providing our definitions and obtaining the definitions that others rely on that leads to different conclusions. Thank you guys. Excited to see you next week and to keep talking to you throughout the week.